The first frost of October came 3 weeks early that year, and nobody on the Hendricks farm was ready for it. This is the story of an International Harvester Farmall 656, built in 1962, and the stubborn farmhand who refused to let it die. It's a story about diesel engines and dying seasons, about the kind of loyalty that doesn't make sense on paper, and about how sometimes the oldest tools in the shed are the only ones that can save you when everything modern fails at once. Let me back up. The Hendricks family had worked 600 acres of corn and soybeans in the same stretch of glacial till soil for 4 generations. It's good ground, the kind laid down by retreating ice sheets 10,000 years ago, rich in the kind of loam that farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and the Dutch polders both know intimately, even though an ocean separates them. That's not a coincidence. Dutch settlers who came to the American Midwest in the 1800s picked this land specifically because it reminded them of home. Flat, fertile, well-drained once you dealt with the water table. By the 2020s, the Hendricks operation ran on modern iron, 2 GPS-guided combines, a fleet of tractors with cabs that had better climate control than most houses, auto steer, yield mapping, the works. Precision agriculture, they call it. And it works, when it works. The old 656 sat behind the machine shed, half swallowed by burdock and Queen Anne's lace. Tires flat, hood a patchwork of rust and fading red paint. It hadn't run in 11 years. Everyone figured it for scrap. Everyone except Walt. Walt Bacher had been the hired hand on the Hendricks place for 26 years. He wasn't family, not by blood, but he'd shown up the same year old Henry Hendricks buried his wife, and he'd never really left. He knew the farm's fields the way most men know their own hands, which corners flooded in a wet spring, which 40 acres yielded low because of a compacted clay pan 2 feet down, which fence line the deer used at dusk. Walt was the kind of man who fixed things instead of replacing them. He'd grown up the son of a mechanic in a small farming town, one of thousands settled generations back by Dutch and German immigrant families across the American Midwest. Pella, Iowa, Holland, Michigan, Oostburg, Wisconsin. Towns where the church spires and the grain elevators competed for the tallest thing on the horizon, and where a man's word and his tools said more about him than his bank account. He kept the 656 running, barely, long after the Hendricks family had moved on to newer equipment, because his own father had taught him on a tractor just like it, and because, in Walt's mind, a machine that still had good iron in it hadn't earned the scrapyard yet. Every few months he'd wander out, turn a wrench, keep the linkages from seizing, run a rag over the manifold, not restoring it, just refusing to let it finish dying. Young Cal Hendricks, the current owner's son fresh back from ag school, used to tease him about it. "That thing's a doorstop, Walt. We've got 280 horsepower sitting in the shed. Why do you keep babying a tractor that can't pull a disc straight?" Walt never had much of an answer beyond, "Because someday, you'll be glad one thing on this farm doesn't need a computer to start." Nobody believed him. Not yet. The trouble started in the 3rd week of harvest, right when the soybeans were at that narrow window of perfect moisture, around 13%, the sweet spot where you get the best price at the elevator and the least shatter loss in the field. Wait too long past that window, and pods start splitting open on their own, spilling beans on the ground before the combine ever gets there. In a bad year, growers can lose 10 to 15% of yield just from shatter and lodging if the harvest drags on. That's when the first combine's monitor threw an error code across its touchscreen. A fault in the CAN bus wiring harness. One of dozens of digital nervous systems running through a modern combine's electronics. The dealer couldn't get a technician out for 4 days. Every other farm within 60 miles was fighting the same early frost and the same tight harvest window, and repair techs were booked solid. 2 days later, the backup tractor, the one hauling the grain cart between combine and semi, spiked its hydraulic temperature and shut itself down mid-field, a safety failsafe on modern hydrostatic transmissions. Diagnosis: a failed cooling fan clutch, a part on backorder from a supplier 3 states away. Then the Weather Service upgraded their forecast. A hard freeze, followed by 3 days of rain, moving in from the northwest. If the beans didn't come off before that system arrived, the Hendricks farm stood to lose a season's income, not from one field, but from 600 acres of standing crop that would go from harvestable to ruined in a single soaking, freezing week. This is the part people who didn't grow up on a farm don't always understand. A harvest isn't like a paycheck that's merely delayed. A crop left in the field past its window doesn't wait patiently. Soybean pods that shatter don't unshatter. Corn that goes down in wind and rain doesn't stand back up. The economics of a farm are written in a handful of days each year, and if you miss them, there's no do-over until next spring. If the bank lets you see next spring at all. Cal Hendricks, 26 years old and staring down the numbers on the operating loan his family carried, was the one who finally said it out loud at the kitchen table. "We're not going to make it." Walt didn't say anything. He just grabbed his coat. He'd known this day might come, in the back of his mind, for years. That's the real reason he'd kept the 656 alive. Not sentiment alone, but the quiet certainty that machinery, this old, this simple, was also nearly impossible to break, in a way you couldn't fix yourself. The Farmhand 656 has no computer, no sensors, no CAN bus, no touchscreen. It runs on a mechanically injected diesel engine, a simple hydraulic system, and a transmission you shift by hand and clutch. Everything on it is something a farmer with a socket set and a manual could diagnose in the yard, by lantern light if it came to that. That was the whole design philosophy of Cold War-era farm equipment. Build it so a man 300 miles from the nearest dealership could keep it running with parts from his own shop. Walt spent 6 hours that first night getting it roadworthy. New batteries, a rebuilt starter he'd had sitting on a shelf for 4 years, just in case. He bled the fuel lines, cleaned the injectors, aired up the tires from a compressor he ran off a spare generator. Around midnight, the old diesel coughed out a cloud of black smoke, and settled into that low, uneven idle only an old inline-six diesel makes, a sound half the young guys on the farm had never heard before. By morning, the 656 was hitched to the grain cart, running it between the one working combine and the trucks. It wasn't fast. It didn't have the horsepower of the machine it replaced. But it didn't need a software update. It didn't need a part flown in from Ohio. It needed diesel, and it needed Walt, and it had both. For the next 4 days, the farm ran a strange patchwork operation. One dealer-loaned combine, badly needed elsewhere, arrived on the second day to run alongside the repaired original. The old 656 hauled grain cart duty non-stop, joined briefly by a neighbor's tractor when word got around about what was happening. Because that's the other thing about farm country. In Iowa or Wisconsin or the Dutch countryside alike, when a neighbor's harvest is in trouble, other farmers show up without being asked twice. Walt drove 12 14-hour shifts on that old tractor, seat cushion long gone, replaced by a folded moving blanket. No cab, no heat, no radio. Just him, the frost forming on the stubble at dawn, and the rhythm of the auger filling the cart. There's a biological clock running underneath every harvest story like this one. Soybean plants, once mature, are essentially done pulling resources from the soil. The plant's job at that point is just to hold its seed pods together against wind, rain, and gravity, waiting for a combine header to come through. Every day past physiological maturity is a day of pure risk with no reward. No more yield being added, only yield being lost to weather, pests, and time. Corn faces a related but different clock. A hard freeze before corn reaches full maturity, the black layer stage, where the kernel's connection to the cob seals off, can lock in lower test weight and stunt final yield permanently. The Hendricks corn had crossed that line just barely, days before the freeze warning came in, which meant the corn, at least, could wait a little. The soybeans could not, so the family made the call, soybeans first, all resources on the beans, and pray the corn could stand a few more days in the cold. The frost came on schedule, hard and silvering every stalk in the low fields, by 6 a.m. on the 4th day. The last of the soybean acres came off the field 90 minutes before the rain started. An honest 90 minutes, not a Hollywood embellishment, because Cal Hendricks checked his watch twice that morning, the way a man does when he knows exactly how much margin he has left, and it isn't much. The old 646 rolled its last load of the day into the yard with rain already streaking down the hood, headlights barely cutting through the mist, Walt's cap soaked through, hands numb on the wheel. He parked it exactly where it always sat, next to the shed, cut the engine, and just sat there a minute, listening to the diesel tick as it cooled. They got the beans. Every acre. Sold at a solid price a week later, once the elevator lines shortened back down, moisture right where it needed to be. The corn stood through the wet week fine. Corn tolerates a soaking far better than beans tolerate shatter, which is exactly why the family gambled on that order of operations. And the gamble paid off. It came off clean. 10 days later, once the ground firmed up enough to carry equipment again, without rutting the fields for next spring's planting. Cal Hendricks tells this part of the story now to anyone who'll stand still long enough to hear it, usually with his boot up on the old 656's back tire, which still sits by the shed. Restored now, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect. We had every modern advantage money could buy, he says, and every single one of them let us down on the same week, for reasons that had nothing to do with each other. Bad luck timing, a supply chain 3 states away, technology that's brilliant, until the one part you need is sitting on a shelf in another state. And the thing that saved us was 64 years old, had no computer in it anywhere, and ran because one stubborn man refused to let it become scrap metal. Walt, for his part, doesn't take much credit. I didn't do anything special, he says. I just didn't throw away something that still had work left in it. That's it. That's the whole secret. It's not really the whole secret, though, and most people who've spent a life in farming know it. The secret is a philosophy that runs deep in agricultural communities on both sides of the Atlantic, in the American Midwest, and across the old dairy and grain regions of the Netherlands alike. A belief that durability and self-reliance aren't old-fashioned virtues to be nostalgic about. They're insurance. They're the thing standing between a family and ruin when the modern systems everyone depends on all fail in the same unlucky week. There's something else worth understanding here, something agronomists and farm economists have written about for years. Modern precision agriculture is extraordinary. GPS guidance can cut input costs, reduce overlap and waste, and increase yields by meaningful margins across a season. Nobody serious is arguing farms should abandon that technology, but redundancy matters. Every system, no matter how advanced, has a failure point, and the farms that weather the genuinely bad years, the early frosts, the wet harvests, the parts back orders, are often the ones that kept something simple in reserve, a spare generator, a hand-crank well pump, an old tractor that doesn't need a software update to turn over. It's the same logic that keeps a hand-crank radio in a hurricane kit next to the smartphone. The new technology is better, until, for one crucial week, it isn't available. And then the old, unglamorous backup is the only thing standing between you and disaster. The 656 still starts on the first try every time now. Walt sees to that personally, same as he has for over 2 decades. Cal's youngest, 7 years old, has taken to riding along in the field on it, perched on that same folded moving blanket, utterly unbothered by the noise or the smell of diesel, already asking Walt to teach him what every lever does. Some machines get remembered because they were fast, or powerful, or first. This one gets remembered because it simply refused to quit, because somebody refused to let it quit, and because on one cold, wet week in October, when everything modern on that farm went silent at once, an old red tractor built the same year as the first Telstar satellite launch rolled out into the frost and brought the harvest home. If you enjoyed this story, there are thousands more like it, scattered across small farms in this country and across the Atlantic. Quiet, unglamorous, and true. The kind worth remembering and worth passing down.